My name is Linda Hawthorne. I'm 55 years old. And until recently, I was the woman who remembered birthdays, balanced checkbooks, and made sure there were enough hors d'oeuvres at every holiday party. I used to think of myself as reliable, maybe even lucky. But on the night of my 55th birthday, everything I believed about myself, about my marriage, my life was stripped away with a splash of whiskey. It happened in our living room, with people I had known for decades. My husband Charles raised his glass in mock celebration, smirked, and tossed the contents directly at my face. The whiskey burned as it hit my skin, trickled down my neck, and soaked into the collar of the cream silk blouse I had picked out just for the occasion. I didn't move. I couldn't. All I could do was stand there, dripping and humiliated. While laughter filled the room around me like static, Charles thought it was funny. He said something like, "At your age, you're only good for cleaning up," then asked me to bring him another drink. People laughed again. But it was that nervous placed, half-swallowed laughter that stings more than silence. I caught Karen Benson, his colleague's wife, looking away quickly. Her smile tight. Embarrassed for me or for herself? I'll never know. What struck me wasn't just the cruelty. It was how normal it felt. How easily I had come to accept being dismissed, being minimized. That wasn't the first time Charles had belittled me in front of others. But it was the first time I didn't go along with it. I didn't smile. I didn't make a joke. I didn't fetch another drink. I just stood there, watching the man I'd shared 30 years with turn me into a punchline. The whiskey continued to drip from my chin onto my shoes, expensive heels I'd bought, thinking they made me look younger, more vibrant. Now they just felt like props in someone else's cruel theater. I became aware of every eye in the room. Some amused, others uncomfortable, all of them witnessing my humiliation as entertainment. And for the first time in a long time, something inside me didn't shrink. It stirred. A small flame of defiance that had been buried under years of accommodation and compromise began to flicker. I felt it warming my chest, spreading through my limbs, giving me strength I'd forgotten I possessed. This moment would become the catalyst for everything that followed the end of one Linda and the birth of another. The room kept spinning like a carousel. I couldn't step off. I looked around and saw familiar faces, our neighbors, his law partners, their spouses. I had fed their kids, helped organize their retirement parties. Some of them had cried on my shoulder after bad divorces. But that night, no one said a word. No one stepped in. They just pretended it wasn't happening. The music played on. The drinks kept pouring. And I became invisible in my own home. Not a person. Not a wife. Just something to mock. To walk past. To ignore. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and stared at the hardwood floor, counting the scratches I knew by heart. I had polished them. I had cared for them. I had maintained this house like I had maintained my marriage, quietly, steadily, without asking for thanks. Charles was laughing with Frank and John near the fireplace. I heard my name, but not in any way that invited me to join. Just another jab. Another backhanded remark about how I used to be so full of ideas, and now I was lucky if I could manage a grocery list. The cruel words floated across the room like smoke, settling into every corner of my consciousness. Margaret Thompson, my book club friend, caught my eye briefly before looking away. Even she, who had confided in me about her husband's affair just months ago, couldn't bring herself to acknowledge what was happening. The complicity was suffocating. These people who had sat at my dinner table, who had celebrated holidays in my carefully decorated home, were now complicit in my degradation. And yet, no one left. No one said stop. That was the part that dug into me deepest. The complicity. The silence. The way they all seemed to accept that this was just how things were, that Linda Hawthorne was fair game for humiliation. I had spent so long being agreeable, keeping things pleasant, smoothing every wrinkle before it became a tear. But in that moment, I saw myself through their eyes. A woman in her 50s. Outdated. Decor. Someone to joke about. Someone past her expiration date. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making my knees weak. Only, they were wrong. I wasn't done. I just hadn't been seen clearly in a long time. The woman they thought they knew, the accommodating, invisible, Linda, was about to surprise them all. That night, something inside me shifted like tectonic plates, realigning after years of pressure. Instead of following the script I had learned over 3 decades, I did something I never thought I would. I said something. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that cut through the noise of the party like a blade through silk. Enough. The word came out no louder than a whisper, but it carried the weight of 30 years of swallowed pride and buried resentment. The room didn't immediately quiet. Conversations continued. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed at a joke near the kitchen. But Charles heard me. His smirk faded, replaced by a shadow of confusion and something that might have been fear. He asked me what I'd said, his voice sharp and incredulous, the way he might address a child who had spoken out of turn. I repeated it, this time louder, my voice steady, despite the storm raging inside my chest. I said, enough? You've all had enough. The words felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking a language I'd forgotten I knew. The room went silent then. Really silent. The kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing. For the first time in years, I wasn't invisible. Every eye was on me. But instead of the usual dismissive glances, I saw something else. Surprise. Maybe even a flicker of respect from some of the women who had been pretending not to notice my humiliation. Charles tried to recover with a joke, his voice too loud and too forced. He made some comment about women of a certain age and their dramatics. But the spell had been broken. The easy cruelty of moments before had been replaced by an uncomfortable tension that hung in the air like smoke. People began to shift uncomfortably, suddenly finding their drinks fascinating or checking their phones. I didn't wait for his recovery to gain momentum. I left the room, my heels clicking against the hardwood with more authority than I'd felt in years. I retreated to the guest bedroom, a place I had never dared to claim for myself before, always leaving it pristine for visitors who rarely came. As I lay there in the dark, listening to the muffled sounds of the party I had once helped plan, I realized that this small act of rebellion was the first step towards something much bigger. I wasn't just tired of being humiliated, I was ready to be free. The woman who had whispered enough was someone I was just beginning to meet. The morning after that night felt surreal, like waking up in someone else's life. I moved through the house like a ghost, careful not to wake Charles as he snored in our bedroom, or what I now realized was really his bedroom. I had been sharing space in his world for so long. I'd forgotten what it felt like to claim territory of my own. The house felt foreign in the early morning light, to like a museum I had curated and maintained, but never truly inhabited. Every piece of furniture, every carefully chosen decoration, every perfectly arranged throw pillow told the story of a woman who had spent decades making a home for someone else while disappearing a little more each day. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee that tasted different, somehow stronger, more bitter, more real. For months, I had thought about leaving but never dared to act on the impulse. The thought would come to me in quiet moments while folding Charles's shirts. While preparing dinner, he would eat while reading his phone. While lying awake, listening to his confident snoring. But I had always pushed it away, dismissed it as the fantasy of a woman who had watched too many movies about late-life reinvention. That morning, though, the fantasy felt like a plan. I opened my browser and searched for trains to Santa Maris, a small coastal town 3 hours away where my college friend Diane had moved after her divorce 5 years ago. She had sent me pictures of her little cottage by the sea, in her art studio, her garden where she grew herbs and vegetables. At the time, I had looked at those pictures with a mixture of envy and disbelief. How did someone just start over like that? Now I understood. You start over by buying a train ticket. I booked a seat on the 2:15 afternoon train, my hands trembling slightly as I entered my credit card information. Then I called Jessica, my daughter, who lived 2 states away with her husband and twin boys. Her voice was groggy when she answered. It was early, and she had always been a night owl like her father. I asked her something I had rehearsed 1,000 times in my head but never dared to say out loud. If I left your father, would you hate me? The question hung in the air between us like a bridge I wasn't sure would hold my weight. Silence stretched through the phone line, and I could hear her breathing, could almost feel her processing the words. Then she took a deep breath and said something that changed everything. Mom, I've been waiting for this call for years. Her words unlocked a floodgate inside me. All the fear I'd been holding, the fear of breaking my family, the fear of judgment, the fear of being seen as a failure, began to crumble like a dam giving way to inevitable floodwaters. Jessica's support became the lifeline I didn't know I needed. We talked for an hour. She told me about conversations she'd had with her husband about my marriage, about how they'd watched me shrink over the years, about how worried they'd been. She said she'd been hoping I would find the courage to leave, but hadn't known how to tell me without seeming like she was interfering. You deserve to be happy, Mom, she said. And I realized I couldn't remember the last time someone had said that to me and meant it. I packed carefully, methodically, like I was preparing for a journey I'd been planning my whole life. 2 suitcases held essentials, clothes that actually fit me and made me feel good, toiletries, a few photographs of Jessica and the boys, and the leather-bound journal my grandmother had given me years ago. The journal was still blank, its pages waiting for a story worth telling. I moved through the house one last time, seeing it with new eyes. The Persian rug Charles had insisted on buying despite my preference for something simpler. The heavy furniture that made the rooms feel smaller than they were. The color palette of muted grays and beiges that he had deemed sophisticated, but that had always made me feel like I was living in a hotel rather than a home. In the kitchen, I wrote a note on the back of an envelope, nothing dramatic. No accusations or explanations. Just a simple statement: I deserve better than last night. Don't try to contact me for a while. Linda. I left it on the counter next to the coffee maker, where he would find it when he stumbled down for his morning caffeine ritual. The hardest part was the wedding photos on the mantel. I looked at the young woman in white, who had been so sure about her future, so confident that love would be enough to sustain a lifetime. She looked like a stranger to me now, someone I might have been friends with in another life. I didn't take the photos. That woman belonged to this house, this life. I was becoming someone else. As I loaded my bags into the car, I noticed Mrs. Ruth from next door, tending her garden in the early morning light. She was in her 70s, a widow who had lived alone for the past decade and seemed to thrive in her solitude. She looked up as I closed the trunk, and our eyes met across the perfectly manicured lawn that separated our driveways. Without a word, she walked over and handed me a small card. It was for a women's center in Santa Maris, a place to find support and rediscover strength. Her eyes were kind but knowing, and I realized she had been watching, understanding more about my situation than I had ever imagined. Take care of yourself, dear, she said, squeezing my hand. You're braver than you know. As I drove away from the house that had been both a sanctuary and a cage, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. Not just for escape, but for discovery. The miles between me and Charles stretched out endlessly ahead. But for the first time, they didn't feel like distance from safety. They felt like a path toward something I couldn't yet name but desperately wanted to find. I drove with the windows down, letting the morning air whip through my hair. The radio played songs I hadn't heard in years, and I found myself singing along to lyrics I'd forgotten I knew. In the rearview mirror, my house, our house, Charles's house grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely behind a curve in the road. The woman driving away was not the same woman who had been humiliated with whiskey the night before. She was someone new. someone who was just beginning to understand what it meant to choose herself. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to travel. Santa Maris was quieter than I expected, a coastal town that seemed to exist in its own pocket of time, where the pace of life was determined by tides rather than clocks. Colorful shops lined narrow streets that curved and wound like the coastline itself, and the salty breeze carried the promise of possibility in every gust. I checked into a quaint bed and breakfast called the Seahorse Inn, nestled just a block from the beach where I could hear the waves from my room. When the proprietor, a cheerful woman named Susan, asked for my name, I hesitated for just a moment before saying, Linda Reeves. My maiden name felt strange on my tongue, after 30 years of being Mrs. Hawthorne. But it also felt like putting on clothes that actually fit. Saying those two words out loud, Linda Reeves felt like a small act of rebellion. A reclaiming of the person I used to be before I became someone's wife. Someone's caretaker. Someone's invisible support system. Linda Reeves had been an English literature major, with dreams of teaching, of writing, of traveling to places that inspired her. She had been someone who laughed easily, and wore bright colors, and believed in the power of poetry to change the world. The next morning, I wandered the streets without purpose, letting my feet carry me wherever they wanted to go. I found myself standing in front of a local art gallery called Ocean Light Studio. The windows were lined with vibrant watercolor seascapes that seemed to capture not just the visual beauty of the coast, but the emotion of it, the way the ocean could be both peaceful and powerful, gentle and fierce. A hand-painted sign in the window invited visitors to join weekly painting classes. Something inside me stirred a memory of the artist I once dreamed of becoming. Back when I thought I had time for dreams. In college, I had spent hours in the art building, experimenting with different mediums, losing myself in the process of creation. But marriage and practical concerns had slowly eroded that part of me until I could barely remember what it felt like to make something beautiful just for the joy of making it. The gallery owner, Martha Chen, was a woman in her 60s with silver hair neatly braided down her back and paint-stained fingers that spoke of a life devoted to art. She welcomed me with a warm smile and kind eyes that seemed to see more than most people bothered to look for. When she asked if I wanted to try the Wednesday watercolor class, I heard myself saying yes before my practical mind could interfere with excuses about not being good enough or not having painted in years. As I wrote my maiden name on the registration form, I felt a mix of nerves and excitement I hadn't experienced in decades. For the first time since I left Charles, I felt seen not as a wife, not as someone's caretaker, but as Linda Reeves, a woman who was ready to rediscover what it meant to create something beautiful. Walking through the streets of Santa Maris the next day, I found myself drawn to a small boutique with a window display that seemed to glow with color. The dresses hanging there were in bold, vibrant hues: emerald green, sapphire blue, sunset orange colors that seemed to pulse with life and energy. I had spent so many years hiding behind muted tones that these bright fabrics felt almost foreign, like artifacts from a more vivid world I had forgotten existed. For years, my wardrobe had been a study in neutrals: grays, beiges, navy blues that Charles deemed appropriate for a woman of your age. I had learned to dress like camouflage, blending into backgrounds, avoiding attention, making myself smaller and less noticeable with every passing year. Safe colors for a safe life. Colors that wouldn't draw criticism or comment. But something about Santa Maris made me want to be seen. Maybe it was the way the light seemed different here. Softer, but more alive. Maybe it was the fact that nobody here knew Linda Hawthorne, the woman who had been diminished sip by sip, comment by comment, year by year. Here, I could be Linda Reeves. And Linda Reeves might be the kind of woman who wore colors that made her eyes sparkle. The saleswoman was a stylish woman in her 60s with a silver bob, and the kind of confident bearing that comes from knowing exactly who you are. She noticed my hesitation and smiled kindly, pointing to a flowing tunic in azure silk that seemed to shimmer like water in sunlight. "This would make your eyes absolutely sparkle," she said, and I felt myself starting to respond with my automatic reflex. My husband prefers neutrals. But I caught myself mid-sentence, the words dying on my lips like a song I no longer wanted to sing. I used to wear neutrals. I corrected. And it was the first time I had admitted aloud that I was ready for change. Ready to stop living according to someone else's preferences and start discovering my own. I purchased the tunic, along with a pair of silver earrings that dangled just below my shoulders and caught the light when I moved. In the dressing room mirror, I saw someone I barely recognized, a woman with color in her cheeks and light in her eyes. Someone who looked like she might have stories to tell and dreams to pursue. Leaving the shop, I felt a thrilling mix of fear and exhilaration. It was such a small rebellion, a blue shirt and some silver jewelry, but it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been tucked away for far too long. I walked taller, my shoulders back, the fabric of the tunic flowing around me like water. Like freedom. People on the street seemed to notice me differently. Not with the dismissive glances I had grown accustomed to, but with the kind of acknowledgement given to someone who exists fully in their own skin. I was beginning to understand that choosing to be seen was the first step toward being truly alive. Back at the bed and breakfast, my phone buzzed with the persistence of an angry hornet. Charles had discovered my note and was leaving one voicemail after another. Each one a study in manipulation disguised as concern. The messages started calm, almost reasonable, but quickly escalated into the familiar pattern of control I had lived with for 3 decades. Linda, this is ridiculous. You need to come home. I'm hosting the Morrison dinner tomorrow night. And you know how important this is for the firm. His voice carried that tone of barely contained irritation that used to make me rush to fix whatever I had supposedly done wrong. The next message was more insistent. People are asking questions. Karen called wondering if you were sick. What am I supposed to tell them? That my wife has lost her mind and abandoned her responsibilities. The accusation stung. But not in the way it would have just days ago. Instead of shame, I felt a strange kind of clarity. By the 4th message, his mask had slipped entirely. This is embarrassing. Linda, you're making me look like a fool. Whatever little tantrum this is, it needs to stop. You're being unreasonable. And frankly, I'm concerned about your mental state. Maybe you need to see someone. Get some help. I listened to each message with growing understanding. This was the pattern I had lived with for 30 years, my feelings dismissed as overreactions. My needs labeled as unreasonable. My independence reframed as instability. Charles wasn't worried about my well-being. He was worried about his dinner party. His reputation. His inconvenience. None of the messages asked if I was safe. None of them acknowledged what had happened at the party. None of them contained even a hint of apology or self-reflection. It was all about control and blame. About getting me back into my assigned role as the invisible woman who made his life run smoothly. The final message was the most revealing. I don't know what's gotten into you, but this needs to stop. I need you to come home and fix this mess you've created. The house is falling apart without you. I can't find anything. And I have important people coming over. You're being selfish. Linda, this isn't like you. But that was where he was wrong. This was exactly like me, like the real me that had been buried under years of accommodation and compromise. The me that had opinions and desires and boundaries. The me that deserved better than being someone's unpaid housekeeper and emotional punching bag. I read each message with growing clarity. Then deleted them one by one. I wouldn't respond to the drama. Wouldn't get pulled back into the cycle of guilt and obligation that had kept me trapped for so long. For the first time in my marriage, I was refusing to manage Charles's emotions or solve his problems. I turned off my phone and went to sleep. And for the first time in years, I didn't lie awake worrying about someone else's feelings. 3 days later, an email arrived that felt like a declaration of war. It was from Henderson, Walsh and Associates, Charles's law firm, but not from Charles himself. This was official. Cold. Calculated. The subject line read, "Notice regarding marital assets and abandonment of domicile." My hands trembled as I opened it. The legal language was dense and intimidating, clearly designed to make me feel small and overwhelmed. They accused me of abandoning the marital home without justification and claimed I was exhibiting signs of mental instability that raised concerns about her decision-making capacity. They wanted to freeze all joint assets and cut off my access to our shared finances until I returned to the marital home and submitted to psychiatric evaluation. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Charles wasn't just trying to control me through guilt and manipulation anymore, he was weaponizing the legal system, using his professional connections to paint me as an unstable woman who couldn't be trusted with her own life. It was psychological warfare dressed up in legal terminology. But what they didn't know was that I had been preparing for this possibility, perhaps unconsciously, for months. After Charles had mocked me for wearing a dress he deemed too young at a firm party last spring, I had quietly opened a separate bank account at a different institution. It wasn't an act of defiance at the time. I had told myself it was just practical. A small emergency fund in case something happened to Charles. The account held the modest inheritance from my grandmother that I'd kept secret for years, along with money I'd saved from the household budget bit by bit. It wasn't much, maybe enough to live modestly for 6 months, but it was mine. Completely and legally mine. Charles had never known about it, had never controlled it, had never had any claim to it. I felt a strange mix of fear and empowerment as I forwarded the legal notice to Diane, my college friend who had become a family law attorney after her own difficult divorce. She called me within an hour, her voice filled with the righteous anger of someone who had seen this playbook before. "This is intimidation, Linda. Pure and simple. They're trying to scare you into coming back by threatening your financial security. But you have rights. And we're going to fight for every one of them." For the first time in decades, I felt like I had an advocate. Someone who was on my side without reservation or condition. Diane began explaining my options. My rights. The process ahead? It wouldn't be easy. But it would be worth it. That night, I sat on the small balcony of my room at the inn, watching the waves crash against the shore in the distance. The legal battle ahead was daunting. But I wasn't the helpless woman Charles thought he was fighting. I was Linda Reeves. And I was stronger than he had ever bothered to notice. One afternoon, while walking through the town center, a sudden summer storm caught me completely off guard. The sky had been clear just moments before. But coastal weather has its own rules. And within minutes, sheets of rain were falling like a curtain being drawn across the world. I dashed into the nearest shelter, which happened to be a small independent bookstore called Between the Lines. I stumbled through the door, dripping and slightly out of breath, probably looking like a refugee from the storm. The owner, a man in his 50s, with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair, and looked up from behind the counter and smiled, without the slightest hint of annoyance at my soggy intrusion. "Looks like you got caught in nature's surprise," he said, offering me a towel without hesitation. "I'm Tom Rivera. Welcome to my little sanctuary." The bookstore was exactly the kind of place I had always dreamed of spending hours in floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with books. Cozy reading nooks with comfortable chairs. The smell of old paper and fresh coffee mixing in the air. Poetry sections. Local authors. Handwritten recommendations, tucked between the volumes like love letters to literature. As I dried off, Tom and I struck up a conversation that flowed as naturally as the rain outside. Somehow, perhaps because he was a stranger with no investment in my past, I found myself telling him about the whiskey incident the night Charles threw it in my face. The humiliation. The way it had become the catalyst for everything that followed. To my surprise, Tom didn't flinch or look uncomfortable. He didn't offer platitudes or try to minimize what had happened. Instead, he listened with the kind of attention that had become foreign to me. And then he shared something of his own. "I went through a divorce 5 years ago," he said, his voice gentle but matter-of-fact. "My ex-wife spent the last years of our marriage making me feel like I was never quite good enough. Never quite successful enough. When I finally left, she told everyone I was having a midlife crisis. Maybe I was. But sometimes a crisis is just clarity arriving fashionably late. He told me how he had left his corporate job, something in marketing that had paid well, but felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit, and used his severance to open the bookstore he had always dreamed of. It hadn't been easy. But it had been honest in a way his previous life never was. That brief encounter felt like balm on a wound I hadn't realized was still bleeding. Here was someone who understood loss and reinvention. Someone who saw me not as a broken woman or a victim, but as a person in the process of rediscovering herself. There was no judgment. No advice. Just recognition. One human being acknowledging another's journey toward authenticity. The storm outside began to ease. But inside, a different kind of peace was taking hold. Sometimes sanctuary comes in the most unexpected forms. 2 weeks later, fate presented me with an opportunity I never could have imagined. The local library's guest speaker for their monthly literary series had canceled at the last minute. And Martha, from the art gallery, who was friends with the librarian, mentioned that there was a woman new to town who had once been an English teacher and might be interested in filling in. I hadn't spoken in front of a crowd in 30 years. Not since my teaching days before marriage consumed my identity. But when the librarian called and asked if I would consider giving a talk about poetry, something inside me said yes, before my rational mind could interfere with all the reasons why I shouldn't. I spent 3 days preparing, dusting off my old notes and rediscovering my passion for the confessional poets Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, Adrienne Rich, the women who had transformed personal pain into powerful art. These were the poets who had spoken to me in my 20s, when I still believed that literature could change the world, that words had the power to heal and transform. The evening of the talk, I stood before a small circle of 15 or 20 people in the library's community room. My voice trembled at first, rusty from disuse, uncertain after years of being silenced or dismissed. But as I began to read aloud from Plath's Lady Lazarus and Rich's Diving into the Wreck, something magical happened. The words that had once comforted me in my darkest moments now flowed through me like a current, connecting me to the small audience in ways I had forgotten were possible. I spoke about the courage it takes to write about pain, the way these women had refused to make their suffering pretty or palatable, how they had claimed their right to be angry and complicated and real. The room was silent except for the occasional nod or quiet intake of breath. I watched faces light up with recognition, saw people leaning forward, completely engaged. An elderly man in the front row wiped his eyes during my reading of Sexton's The Truth the Dead Know. A middle-aged woman took notes frantically, as if trying to capture something precious before it escaped. When I finished, the applause was warm and genuine. But what moved me most was what happened afterward. Several people approached me with thanks and stories of their own struggles. A teenage girl with purple hair shyly asked if I would look at her poetry sometime. A woman about my age pressed my hand and said the talk had given her courage to start writing again after 20 years. For the first time in decades, I felt seen not as a wife or a victim or someone's helper, but as Linda Hawthorne, a woman with something valuable to say. I had found my voice again. And it turned out it had been there all along, just waiting for the right moment to sing. 3 weeks into my new life in Santa Maris, Jessica called with news that should have worried me more than it did. Charles had been hospitalized after what she diplomatically called a cooking accident, though the details she shared painted a picture of a man so helpless without his invisible support system that he had nearly burned down the house. Apparently, he had attempted to make dinner for the first time in our 30-year marriage. The menu was ambitious for someone whose culinary skills had never progressed beyond making coffee and opening wine bottles, and salmon with some kind of sauce. Roasted vegetables. Rice. He had put everything in the oven, and then, in typical Charles fashion, had gotten distracted by a phone call with a client. "Mom." He forgot about the food completely, Jessica said, and I could hear the mixture of exasperation and dark amusement in her voice. The smoke alarm went off, but he was in his office with noise-canceling headphones on. Mrs. Patterson next door saw smoke coming out of the kitchen window and called the fire department. The firefighters found Charles passed out on the kitchen floor. overcome by smoke from the burning dinner. The salmon had turned to charcoal. The vegetables were unrecognizable, and the smoke had filled the entire house. He was taken to the hospital for smoke inhalation and observation. Though physically he was fine, the doctors said he was lucky. Jessica continued. But Mom, you should see the kitchen. It's going to need to be completely renovated. There's smoke damage throughout the house. I found myself feeling oddly detached from the drama. The old Linda would have been rushing home, full of guilt and worry, ready to fix everything and make it all better. But this Linda Reeves felt something different. Not kite satisfaction, but a kind of clear-eyed recognition of what this incident really revealed. Is he asking for me to come back? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Not exactly, Jessica said carefully. He's mostly complaining about how inconvenient this all is and how he doesn't understand why the stove is so complicated. He hired a cleaning service to deal with the smoke damage, but they said they can't do anything until the kitchen is gutted and rebuilt. Then she added something that made everything crystal clear. He told me the whole thing wouldn't have happened if you hadn't abandoned your responsibilities. He said you always handled the cooking, and that it's not fair to expect him to suddenly learn at his age. There it was. Even in the aftermath of nearly burning down our house, Charles couldn't see his own helplessness as a problem. Instead, it was my fault for not being there to take care of him. At 62 years old, he genuinely believed that basic life skills like cooking were somehow beneath him. That taking care of himself was an unreasonable expectation. Jessica, I said, in surprising myself with the firmness in my voice, your father isn't missing me. He's missing his housekeeper, his cook, his personal assistant. He's missing the woman who made his life run smoothly, so he never had to think about the practical details of being human. The realization wasn't bitter, it was liberating. For years, I had convinced myself that Charles needed me, that our marriage was a partnership, that I was valued and loved. But the truth was simpler and sadder. I had been an employee he didn't have to pay, a service provider he took for granted, a convenience he only noticed when it was gone.